It's interesting. We have some families that we know that have a policy that if you're not an operator, you're ineligible for ownership. What we always want to recognize with our families is that the love can be equal and it can be channeled and equalized in different ways. So in no way is this a disruption of how you feel about the family member and how you care for them and their legitimacy as a member of the family. So that's a starting point to even just set the groundwork. Equality of inheritance is a long-standing tradition. So you walk into the equation and you make those observations that you've just made, which is authority and ownership really are not aligned.
Welcome to Disruptive Successor, a show for next generation leaders in family businesses and entrepreneurs who want to disrupt the status quo and take their existing business to a whole new level. We all know that what got us here isn't going to get us there. This show will provide inspiration, advice, and resources to help you create massive impact. This podcast is sponsored by myself, Jonathan Goldhill, and my company, the Goldhill Group, where we provide coaching for growing companies. I'm Jonathan Goldhill, and my purpose is simple: to guide entrepreneurial leaders in family businesses towards more freedom and fulfillment. I want entrepreneurs to get clarity around the changes that will make them and their businesses more successful so they can experience the same freedom I've enjoyed in my life. Our proven practices challenge business owners to think differently about their business and how they're running it, and quite literally become game changers in our clients' companies. Learn more at thegoldhillgroup.com website, where you can schedule your free strategy session. Hello, it's Jonathan Goldhill, and welcome back to the Disruptive Successor Show. Today's guest is someone who consistently brings clarity to some of the most complex and often emotionally charged issues in family business. Maryann Bell is my guest today. She's joined us before in two powerful conversations. In episode 153, we explored the importance of prenups in safeguarding business ownership, where she reframed prenups as essential governance tools, not just legal protections. And in episode 168, we talked about how and why having difficult conversations matter, where she showed how families can address sensitive topics like money, succession, and ownership without damaging relationships. Maryann leads the advisory practice at Wingspan Legacy Partners, where she works with multi-generational families to design governance structures, ownership frameworks, and policies that preserve both enterprise value and family relationships over time. She has a unique ability to help families navigate the intersection of ownership, leadership, and legacy, especially when those elements fall out of alignment. So today, we're going deeper into what may be one of the most misunderstood and dangerous assumptions in family business, and that is that being fair means being equal. Because what we're going to unpack is this: equal ownership, especially for family members not working in the business, can quietly create resentment, distort incentives, and even undermine the very people responsible for growing the company. And in many cases, the only sustainable model is one where fair is not equal, where ownership, rewards, and decision-making align with contribution, responsibility, and stewardship. We're going to explore some real-world examples, including a $2 billion family business where misaligned ownership created generational tension, and how families can rethink everything from sweat equity to supporting non-operating family members to the role of outside advisors in breaking deadlocks. Maryann, welcome back to the show.
Great to be here, Jonathan. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, it's fantastic to have you back again. And you know, in family business, there's this deeply held belief that you have to treat everyone equal, especially your children. But what I've seen, and I know you have too, is that equality often creates more problems than it solves, especially when contributions aren't equal. So today I want us to unpack this idea that fair isn't always equal, and how families can make better decisions around ownership, compensation, and roles.
Jonathan, I'll tell you just one thing that I always like to start with, and that is when you talk about equal, fair is not equal. Well, what we always want to recognize with our families is that the love can be equal, and it can be channeled and equalized in different ways. So in no way is this a disruption of how you feel about the family member and how you care for them and their legitimacy as a member of the family. So that's a starting point to even just set the groundwork.
Yeah. So, I know what you're saying sounds really logical on the surface, and I agree with it. But where it becomes really difficult in practice is that families conflate emotion, history, and then there's these relationships that are layered in. So let's talk about what actually happens when families default to equal. What does that create over time?
I think in some ways it feels simple. I taught a class at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and there was a father in the audience who was accompanying his son. And I said to him, "Hey, Dad, is fair equal?" And he said, "I thought so at first." And so it feels comfortable and easy and logical to address you. But what happens, as you suggest, is that authority, decision-making, value creation, the merit that the entire family benefits from is often driven by one individual. And that can create sensitivities both within his or her generation, but often even more amplified at the next gen, who sees their father working hard for the family, but other members of the family benefiting from it.
Yeah. So, I guess why do you think families default to equal, and what are they afraid will happen if they don't?
I think if it feels like it's a reflection or a surrogate for care and love.
Yeah.
And really, the decision and stewardship of the business needs to be done to serve all the stakeholders. And not that the family doesn't matter, but it's almost the family's last. The ecosystem of stakeholders really starts with the employees, the extended community that benefits from the business. I mean, we all know family businesses have a huge impact on their communities, and stewarding it for that entire audience should be considered, and not just the sensitivities of the family. I literally had a call this morning where we were expressed surprised at how much dancing around someone's feelings happen in this family business to accommodate sensitivities, and it's not accommodating and caring for the entire stakeholder community.
Some members who feel like, hey, there's an elephant in the room and nobody's talking about it. It becomes a ticking time bomb, doesn't it?
It does. And again, as I mentioned before, you can have these broad strokes observations, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's true for every family. But in many cases, a sibling will accommodate another sibling kind of in the big brother, big sister, or even little brother, little sister mode of saying, well, I'll take care of them because they're either the least capable or the more shy, or some type of vulnerability that member has grown up with. But it really starts to create tension and resentment in the next gen, where they see the parent doing all the work, simply terms.
Yeah, I think one of the things you start to see is that people disengage. There's passivity among some owners, and others may seem like they're aggressive. And so there's just the tension that kind of builds up, and it overflows to the Thanksgiving Day dinners, and Christmas dinner get-togethers. These are really difficult things for family businesses to manage. And it's almost like, I'm sure you would agree, that they need to have separate meetings, family meetings, where they deal with these family issues, and business meetings where they deal with these business issues.
Jonathan, exactly.
Create the boundaries, right?
That's exactly right. And let me just step back and say, what that does, that resentment, dissatisfaction, disengagement, all that you've suggested, it's really dismantling a culture of meritocracy. And we all know that that's the culture that many businesses grow and thrive in, and that they expect from their non-family employees and community members. And to dismantle that within the family is a real disruption of the overall culture of the business. And many of these families don't want to do that. They have a culture of meritocracy outside of the business, whether it's an academic performance or how you conduct yourselves. And they have high expectations for the family. So it really needs to be consistently mirrored in the business.
All right, so let's take this step further and get into the concept of sweat equity versus blood equity, because I think that's a core tenet of this conversation. So let's say you've got one family member who's putting in the time, taking the risk. Maybe they started because they were older. Maybe they started in the business younger. They're growing the business. They're actually the driving force of this business now. And others who are owners by virtue of being family. So how do you think of sweat equity versus blood equity in a way that's actually fair here?
Well, the reality is in many of the cases where we're involved, you see what the situation is. And to your point, this equality of inheritance has been a long-standing tradition. So you walk into the equation and you make those observations that you've just made, which is authority and ownership really are not aligned. And so like all governance tools, thinking about ownership is something that the family needs to consider really strategically. And what we strongly recommend, and this is a tool and a mechanism, is that a sweat equity pool is created so that owner operators can be rewarded for their contribution and increase their ownership percentage.
Do you encourage your clients who are not operating and not in the business to have equity, no equity, equity in something else that is equal if it's available?
It's interesting. We have some families that we know that have a policy that if you're not an operator, you're ineligible for ownership. So that's one structure and business and governance approach that would say that conflict is not going to happen. But having said that, there is in many families a sense of pride in the business, pride in the impact on the community and the profile that the business and family have created, and therefore a modest amount of ownership and then economic value. Oftentimes families have distribution policies, is something that families feel is important. But allowing for that in a minority way is something that is again, looking at the overall economics of the business and making sure a distribution policy supports it is something that we feel is fine. We do think owners need to be informed owners. Some owners are passive and have no active role in the board or operations, but we do think owners in general need to be informed, but they don't necessarily need to have a controlling position.
I'm not going to go down, I don't think we're going to go down this avenue, but I will point out a thought, which is that it's something I've experienced personally, seeing it in my family's business, is that some members of the family are not fit to be in business whatsoever. They might have mental health issues. Yep. There might be drug or substance abuse issues. There might be lack of responsibility around spending money, having money, and this makes it even more, I think, complicated.
You're exactly right. And again, there's different tools and mechanisms. I would say in that circumstance, that two considerations would be a family would have a code of conduct and then a pretty strict employment policy that, again, scaffolded with this idea of meritocracy and advancement in your career that would only be allowed through fulfilling the expectations of the employment policy. There's one family that we work with in Turkey that it's interesting. They limit the number of family members who work in the business, and advancement for family members is contingent upon non-family managers approving, a promotion.
Wow.
So you gotta play fair with the non-family members, not just play fair, but carry your weight and serve as a valuable person. I mean, having said that, I will tell you, we have another family that we do not advise, but we've been kind of counsel to. This is very scary. It's a construction business, and family members routinely show up drunk. And I mean, that's just terrible for the whole business. So to that extent, again, there needs to be consequences for any employee who has that, impairment in the office or in the workplace, but particularly family members.
It goes to make some sense to have an outside advisory board or a board of directors that kind of manages and puts some guardrails around some of this, because I can think of, again, in my family of origin, their business was my grandfather and his brother. The brother was the door banger down. And I mean, he even got into the White House and got thrown out during Nixon's time because he was the one who opened the door. And I'm sure they would never have accepted an outside board. But it would have been really helpful to have outside advisors sometimes to try and create some guardrails around this is appropriate behavior, this is inappropriate behavior. So,
Jonathan, we love the structure of boards, and an advisory board is in some ways a light lift. It's not fiduciary. They're not bound to the recommendations of the board. And in many cases, you bring in either an industry expert, a family dynamics person who has credibility with the family, external to just, the CEO, or even in some cases, just a professional. There's one board we brought in an accounting, the family's accounting business, they're the partner in the accounting firm. So there's a higher standard of professionalism that's expected because this person's kind of not just their guardrails of policy, but this person's overseeing all the dynamics.
Yeah. I'm sure you run across this as well. I ran across this with a client recently where compensation and ownership are kind of confused with each other. They wanted like all the children to be making the same amount of money. And one child has been there for 10 more years, is 5 years more the senior, and is driving the value in the company. I'm like, This is so not fair, guys.
But this goes back to this meritocracy should be the driving engine of all decisions in that scaffold the overall business, and compensation committees are so important. I'll tell you, in the boards that we do create, that's typically the first subcommittee that we create.
And what's your experience, because you've been working with a lot of companies of very significant size, with regard to ownership being earned versus inherited?
I would say inherited traditions are in every single family we've worked with. Let me flip to one best practice, just because to show out there is a few outliers out there. We're working with a family in Latin America, and they have a long tradition of concentrated ownership, where there's been 4 or 5 family members. They're only on G3 now, but the original founder had 6 children, and he gave his youngest son the majority. Well, let me step in and say there was little bits of shares given to everybody, to all the children in through the estate planning. But one son who worked in the business had an effective sweat equity program because he basically earned shares that the father owned. And so that by the time the father passed, he'd had a 60% ownership. And then in addition to that, they had a buy-sell. So he cobbled up the little pieces from his siblings. They wanted to sell it. It wasn't like it was stolen. It was a buy-sell program. This price discovery was an external valuation organization came in and said what the right price was. And so now he's the CEO and he has 80% ownership. And now we've codified it in their family constitution saying, we believe in concentrated ownership. We will continue to construct mechanisms and ways in which we create access to sweat equity and a concentrated inheritance program.
Interesting. Just as a quick sidebar. So you're working with companies all over the world. Are you seeing different things with different cultures? India versus Latin America versus maybe other parts of Asia versus US I
do think, yes. There's a long tradition in some of the parts of the world where the oldest is I don't want to say cared for more, but considered the more logical recipient of senior roles. And so that's definitely a pattern. I think optics and the veneer of harmony is very important internationally. I mean, you mentioned India, it's extremely important there. And so making sure it feels very smooth and externally acceptable is very important. And so that, again, going back to governing principles, do we want merit or do we want optics? And so that's where some of that rub happens, where we need to have honest conversations.
I've been working with a outsourced team in India doing web development stuff for me, and they're very polite. Everything is very nice. And I think that creates a problem because, like, we all read the Pat Lencioni book where constructive conflict is what builds trust. But this would be very difficult in an Indian culture, perhaps, where conflict might be avoided at, prioritizing harmony over it. So interesting.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. All right. So you shared a case about a multi-billion-dollar family business where ownership and contribution were completely misaligned. Can you walk us through what was happening there? Why?
Yeah, it's a lovely family, and in some ways, it's still difficult. And time heals wounds and the saying going. So the first conversations were a little rough and difficult, but I think we've gotten more progress than where we started. But it's a business where it was really started by a grandfather and then a very small level. And then the father built it to a certain level. And then he gave it to his 3 sons. So there was 3 sons. All 3 were in the business. And interestingly enough, they had an ownership of equal percentages. And the sons were running it. The oldest son was the lead CEO, and brother number 2 and brother number 3 were in the business. And the parents were still in the periphery. So that adds another, complex dynamic.
Right.
Brother number 2, early on, pretty quickly within the first decade of that first transition, said, you know what, this is not great for me. I want to have my own business. And so they had one ownership restructure. So they bought out, the 2 brothers bought out the middle brother. And so the ownership structure stayed 45, 45, 10. To your point, do you remove everybody who's a non-operator or do you keep a small percentage in? And it kind of felt good to keep him in at 10% because they were brothers, they built the businesses together, and it just felt good.
And he wasn't starting a competing venture, or was he?
Well, that was interesting. It was an adjacent business, and it was not in any way a competitor. And so there was some business adjacencies, so it kind of made sense for that reason too. So that's a great way to think about strategically. How can we do this so it makes sense?
Right.
So they had that make sense situation. But really what quickly happened is that relatively modest-sized business grew into a multi-billion-dollar business with the brother number 1 as the driver.
Mm-hmm.
And brother number 2 was brother number 3, Susie, was a terrific member of the community and a great upstanding representative of the family and other things non-business things that the family was engaged in. So was serving as a family representative, but not in the creation of value here.
Right.
And I will tell you, the next gen, just as things turn out, Jonathan, the brother who created the value had more kids than the brother who didn't. And so all of a sudden, his kids are saying, eventually I'll be working for my cousins. And there's a part of that didn't quite feel right. And so it's not just the resentment and the disparity there of kind of tension within the children, but the brother who had created the value really felt like he wanted to have full majority control. So whether it's 51 or 60%, but over 50% of control. And again, there's no discord, there's no tension in a negative way about decision making, but it just felt like that was the representation of the authority of the business. So we started having conversations about this. And as I mentioned, the first time was little ruffled feathers. And then again, I don't want to say time heals all wounds. You have to be very careful and thoughtful about this. You can't just wait around for someone to realize it. But to your point, and I know you've done this too in your work, an external advisor really starts to frame this in a way that depersonalizes it and structures it to create that culture of meritocracy that allows for ownership and authority to be aligned.
So it's an interesting situation that occurs at that moment when they start to have these conversations. A few things I want to unpack. What precipitated a lot of this was the second brother saying, I want to go out on my own. And so one question that comes to mind, which is, how should families start this conversation if there isn't that situation that is like an earthquake moment, right? So I think oftentimes the family might come to an impasse or a situation, an earthquake moment, I'm calling it. And then they've got to decide, what is the advisor that we need to talk to? Is it an accountant? Is it a trust and estates attorney? Is it this so-called family business consultant that I'm not sure what they do exactly? I mean, so that's a pivotal moment. So those are the 2 things I wanted to bring up. And
again, every family is in a different situation. And I do think that external advisors can be very helpful in those situations, especially ones that have a real commitment to representing the whole family, not just one branch or one individual. But what I would recommend as a starting point is everyone gets in a room and starts to have some conversations versus starting with the lawyers. So, materiality matters, but I wouldn't drive it. Not that I want to go against the legal rule or the accounting rules, but you got to get to an understanding together in a general, straw man framework, whatever word you want to call, but a general understanding of, what's our outcome goal? And in that case, it was interesting. There was an outcome goal of saying, okay, the brother wants to step back, do his own thing. We got to make sure he's got enough money to be okay. And also we want to make sure he gets a fair value. I mean, there was an interesting push and pull of like, I don't want to get ripped off, but I also don't want to rip off my brother. And so that underlying core of respect was a great foundation. I think those conversations were more quick than one would imagine. And if you start off with that core level of respect, it can work. It can get messy too, and sometimes it takes a little while.
So I think the takeaway here is that, for me, is that whoever the family perceives as the most trusted advisor, whether that be an attorney, an accountant, that's their go-to person.
Yep.
And that advisor needs to know, is this within my lane that I can handle this? Or is it outside and I need to bring in a family business consultant, or I need to consult an accountant or what have you? So I think that's
the good news in these situations is the family owns 100% of the shares.
Yeah.
So it's not that you've got to abide by legal restrictions and accounting rules and all the rest. But having said that, there's not an external person that you need to accommodate.
Exactly. And now we're weaving in governance issues, because governance either comes out of this or precedes this, and it's almost a parallel conversation. So how do you deal with that?
Well, after a restructure like that, you absolutely have a redo, a rewrite of your shareholder agreement, or what are the governing, legal governing principles you have. The family needs to have a family conversation that's separate. And so having those conversations that are separate are really, really important. And, again, a board structure layers on a process that allows for the business arena to have those conversations separately, and bringing in an external person when appropriate is also a real strong accountability strategy there. But, again, many of the families we talk to say, oh, well, we talk about business once a year at dinner. I was like, no, that's not a board meeting, and that's not family governance. And all due respect, that's a great way to kind of look. Many, many great businesses started in basements or kitchens or garages. So that's not a wrong starting point, but you need to evolve. I mean, we mentioned this business was a $10, $20 million business at one point when the brothers first started getting involved, and it's now a $2 billion business. It's a much bigger machine, and the governance needs to evolve with it.
They're pretty well known. I'd recommend listeners go back to that particular episode or go look them up, because there are 4 businesses in the Marin County area that are dealing with highway construction. They're all in the same business, and they're all related to the original Gelati family. They broke off into many different family units. And I guess that's how they dealt with it. And it's interesting now, having had Mike as my guest, that they're now starting to bridge, like having positive conversations among, the family members in the different companies. Pretty amazing that,
Well, and, look, at the end of the day, we want to steward both the family and the business, but it's just not the same rules. And if a family has had the courage and the leadership to have those difficult conversations, to have a reset on ownership, or even break away to have different businesses, and that's the right thing to steward the assets, we hope that the family can then stay together and be together and share that success.
Well, as we said earlier, equal is easy, fair requires leadership. And that is something that usually there's a turning point at some point where this comes up and needs to be addressed. And I'm sure you've seen many different turning points. It could show up.
I'll say one obvious turning point that most families encounter is that, obviously, succession planning, but when that next gen, and we call it at Wingspan the rising gen. So when the next generation of family members are eligible to become employees, creating employment policies and creating a pathway for them to advance, whether it's the non-family members giving them approval or not, that's a unique strategy, but just, do they need to have work experience outside the business? Do you have to have a certain amount of academic, success at the level of a, undergraduate or graduate level? And by the way, those thresholds, you asked about different parts of the world. Latin America, we've had several families in Latin America, very much recognition or requirement to have certain academic tiers to be a certain level in the business. So that's one pattern that we have seen very, very actively. But you want to create not just a culture of of merit, but you want to create a magnet for the business for that rising gen. And a sweat equity program not only, validates that merit and recognizes when they are a contributor, but it's also a magnet for coming to work in the business, because you've got a clear compensation or reward system that says not only you're going to get paid in a bonus and a salary and you'll have career opportunities, but guess what? We're going to create a pathway for you to become an owner. And I think that's a really important thing. You're talking about crossroads. As families are starting to think about, we work with international families as well as American families, but kids have choices today. And at the same time, the world environment is changing. And, whether I'm sure you've had lots of conversations about AI, that's something that's a massive disruptor. And what families like to see is creating an opportunity to bring their young talent into the business, but make sure it's kind of worth it for them.
So again, reflecting on another episode I did with a very close friend of mine who's now deceased. He got into a major car accident a couple of years ago and was killed upon impact. But this is someone I went to business school with. The episode is with Jeffrey Jappa, and he talks a lot about the complications with his dad and his brother. My friend Jeffrey was really the driving force, and he left the business when he didn't see that path to ownership with his dad. And he basically, the message was kind of like, when you're ready to turn this business over to me, I'll buy it from you. And actually put a whole package together to buy the business, and the dad then turned him down. And so he left. And he said, and then the dad at one point said, you need to come back. You were driving this business. I'm not giving it to your brother, and you'll have to figure out how to get him out. It was complicated and messy.
Well, and, again, every family's different, so there's no one formula, but that role of the external advisor sometimes can be valuable to obviously instill trust, talk about best practices, reference other families or other models that seem to have worked, and in some ways neutralize that underlying emotional tension that every family has. There's a natural dynamic between a father and a son that has history that you can't avoid. It's there. And in many cases, and not that this is our entire role, but as the external advisor, if there is frustration or channeled anger or whatever, directing it towards an external person is a better way to disperse it. And just simply put, we're the bad guy. And we're not very popular for a few months.
Exactly true.
And that's okay. It's okay, because I think in many cases, the person really knows it.
Yeah.
And they just want a nice space-saving way to make sure it feels okay and they can adjust.
And, you and I have both heard this from clients before, where one client will say, this is what I've been telling everyone all along. And It wasn't until you came along that it validated it. And by the way, it was like you saw it in the first or second or third meeting. It didn't take long.
Correct.
But they have this behavior that is so baked in that they can't address it. And it's that elephant in the room again. So being a bad cop is sometimes just what our...
Well, listen, I think that foundation of trust and a sense that you're representing the whole family is really important to cultivate and to start as an advisor. And we're all human beings. I'm not going to be disappointed if someone gets mad. I'm going to say that it's uncomfortable for them, but that we could help them find their path. Like the story of your friend, I'm sorry that the father didn't have the willingness to, how amazing that your friend came up with a business plan, as opposed to like this entitlement of, well, I'm going to get it when you die, of I want to buy it, I want to earn it, and I will pay you cash. They could have done it together. What makes me sad is that was a missed I'm so sorry your friend is not with you, but I'm sad about the missed opportunity as well for them to work together, perhaps, with that handoff. And so I think that's one of the things that we want to make sure, as opposed to always being the bad guy, creating opportunities and also finding if someone else is going to find a different path to help them discover that.
So I've experienced the dynamic you're describing, where in the case of my friend's business and another business I'm thinking about, the founder is put on your boots, go to work. They didn't go to school for this. Yeah. My friend went to one of the finest MBA programs, which is where I met him, in entrepreneurship, and was going to start a business in a whole other, like it was fast food versus manufacturing, which was the family business. And so it's that founder who put on the boots and went to work hard and then looks at the son and says, what do you know? You've got an MBA. Like, how good was that? That's good for like going into management at a corporation, but this is a real business. And so sometimes there's that level of disrespect that happened. I saw it in one of my first clients coming out of business school, where the father just kind of poo-poos the younger generation, and it creates a real rift in a family.
Yeah, I mean, those you talk about transition moments. The succession transition is a hard one because, I often call that the die at your desk generation, which is they're going to hold on till the end. And many of that community didn't have external channels that they felt were, they were proud enough of that they would choose to do them elsewise, and their only identity was their business and their leadership of the business. Disregard for others' paths, and even in some ways more credentialed paths. That's a tension that a lot of generations have still even today. And I think that, again, an external person can be helpful to have those conversations to help people find their paths. But, finding an outside identity outside of your business identity is a difficult journey for a lot of people.
All right. I want to just go back to, at Wingspan, you don't refer to the next gen, you refer to them as the rising gen. And I take it that, and because I've been part of a group that's rising gen, they call it a collab, which is people learning together.
Right.
I've always used next gen because my clients are typically millennials. They're older. But when you start to think of rising gen, I think you start to think about younger kids, even maybe ages 5 and up, all the way till maybe 25. And that's where you're really, with a large business, that's where you're really starting to look at vision, values, mission or purpose, and teaching the kids business, financial literacy, getting them engaged at a very young age. Is that why you use the term rising?
Yes. And Jonathan, we love that. We have a family we've worked with for several years now. We have a family meeting in the summer where all 13 members of the family are there. There's 7 grandchildren, originally started ages just barely 13 to 27. And now they're a few years older. But we absolutely incorporated into our family meetings. We developed a mission, vision, values for the family. We talked about what the family stands for. And we really infused this understanding of entrepreneurism into the family. And it's interesting now, 2 of the rising gen are starting their own businesses. So the family has almost been an incubator for developing businesses. And in our last family meeting, 3 family members, actually 4, the 2 are actually starting businesses, the 2 are in college talking about businesses they'd like to start, but they shared that with the whole family and solicited feedback. So they're almost like the family becomes almost like the advisory board, and not on a tactical sense of capital deployment or hiring people, but just a sounding board so that the entrepreneurial business language becomes the language of the family. Of course, there's other language too, but it's something that's very common and that I think young people really can play up. And so those 13-year-olds weren't obviously the same maturity of a 28-year-old, but could really start to amplify their learning to being in that environment.
A couple of years ago, I was at a conference of family businesses, and one of the speakers was a recent graduate from UCLA who was in the family business. It just so happens it was one of my first clients on my own back in 2001. And it's a bakery called King's Hawaiian Bakery. And what they did was they brought many of the younger, let's call them maybe millennial aged, in their 20s, were trying to come to the family with different ideas about different products. And King's Hawaiian Bakery is largely known for a single product that they make that's a category killer. And so instead of the board, I guess, kept saying no, or the family kept saying no to these younger kids, what they did was they created an entrepreneur program, and they brought in an outside venture advisor, and they created a business plan competition. And then it was really merit-based. So it speaks to what you're talking about. And then if it was something that the the family wanted to invest in, then they would base it on merit using this, kind of a board of advisors and they would make an investment, and that young person could run that division.
Jonathan, I think that is an amazing example. And I think, replicated even at different scale is so powerful. And quite frankly, internationally, you see these families with pretty big conglomerates and sometimes very dispersed businesses and unrelated. And I think those types of environments and that cultural cultivation is really important. And how great is it for the family to win together? So they're a minority investor. They could be a person on the advisory council or kind of the kitchen cabinet to begin with if the business is still in the kitchen, but that the family could both invest in and celebrate somebody else's success.
I remember when I was younger, one of my, mother's cousin who ran the manufacturing plant in Philadelphia told me that when my father and uncle, neither of whom were blood-related family, came into the business, they didn't really know where to put them. So they created a knockoff clothing line that was named after the two boys. They called it Walter and Jerry. And what they did was they gave them the benefit of, hey, there's going to be no cost of goods associated with your product line. So that was their venture investment. And it was go sell your suits and see what you guys can create.
I love that because, again, it goes back to the value. You talk about values and the identity of the family. And it's not necessarily, and maybe this one bakery product was a category killer, but it doesn't have to just be that. It can be, the core is we have good, smart ideas, and we invest in each other and we grow each other's businesses. And that is very exciting for a family to perpetuate. And that can last. I hope that the category killer lasts forever, but the idea of cultivating new businesses actually is a sustainable strategy.
Yeah. I can't think of any companies that survive on one product alone unless maybe you're in the business of selling gas or oil.
And at the same time, sometimes when it's not good, it's not really not good. So those people all businesses have stress. And I agree with you. I think very few businesses have a one category killer to survive in perpetuity. But I'll tell you one thing that absolutely has to evolve is families grow faster than businesses often, not always. And so therefore you need to have an evolution of your governance as those moments, whether it's the rising gen entering into the business, but create structures that both validate the culture of meritocracy, create, I use the word magnet because I want to attract them in, and create a reward system, that supports the stewardship of the business.
So, Maryann, this is all great advice, but neither of us are going to write for television because two of the leading shows I think that cover these topics are Taylor Sheridan's Landman and Yellowstone's another one.
Succession, of course, the classic.
Succession, of course. These are all what not to do that makes for great television and filmmaking. So
absolutely. And look, I think that when and again, you shared some drama both in your family and families that you know well. I think, going back to this principle of we're all human, we're all in families. Every family's got complexity. There's always workarounds, some member of a family, and some of that's done for love, and that's okay. Putting together the governance and structure and reward systems for a business isn't just about the family. And that's where you got to take off that family hat and put on the business stewardship hat and do that in a way that creates sustaining structures that are revisited regularly and perhaps modified or pivoted.
All right. So as we are going to recap and we're going to repeat just some key takeaway points here, which is I love the concept of, principles before lawyers, right? Is that too often families go to lawyers too early. They end up stuck in documents instead of decisions, and an interesting point on that is too often wills or trusts are developed without real explanation of why it was done the way it was done. Why did you divide up the pot of money this way? So aligning on principles first, so critical. So for a family listening right now, maybe they're early stage, maybe they're already feeling some of this tension. Where do they begin? What's the first step to moving from equal to something that's actually fair?
Well, I think you want to, revisit what you had mentioned, which is really, the ownership and authority, whether it's decision-making, growth, and the future of the business and how that's aligned. And if we don't have an alignment right now, is there a mechanism to do a reset, sometimes a recapitalization? We talked about this one family that did a major recapitalization where you have a transaction and a reset, or creating a sweat equity program to reward those who are owner-operators to be able to increase their percentage. Now, again, all of this needs to happen in a legal environment. And so at some point, it does need to be scaffolded with a legal agreement because that's the best practices and you really need to do that. But it should start in a conversation of what really are our ownership goals and how are we going to best steward the business today and in future generations.
Is there an initial mindset shift that needs to happen to make all this fall into place?
Yeah, I do think there needs to be, that goes back to the stepping away from both the family arena and the business board meeting, but almost just a takeaway where current owners or current members of the family who are decision makers need to have some honest conversations about how to best reward family members and design a plan for the future. And stepping back and being more strategic is something that really, requires leadership and courage.
Maryann, a great conversation. Let me wrap up by saying, what should really stand out to listeners from this conversation is that fairness in a family business isn't about keeping everyone happy in the moment. It's about aligning ownership, contribution, and responsibility in a way that actually sustains both the business, its employees, its customers, and maybe the community or stakeholders that it serves, and the family over time. And while equal may feel simpler, it often creates the very conflict families are trying to avoid. If you're starting to see where equal may not be working in your business, this is exactly the kind of issue both Maryann and I help families work through. You can start by taking the business health assessment at goldhillgroup.com. That's thegoldhillgroup.com, where you'll identify the single biggest constraint that is preventing your family business from scaling across operations, profitability, leadership, and family dynamics. And if this is something you're dealing with right now, whether it's ownership structure, succession, or family alignment, reach out directly. These are not easy conversations to have internally and having the right structure and facilitation. So Maryann, if listeners want to learn more about your work or connect with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Wingspanlegacy.com is a great way to reach out, and there's contact access to me and my team. I will say, like yourself, Jonathan, we have resources on our website, and I strongly recommend that anybody access some of those resources just to get a sense of some of the approaches that we think that a family should consider.
And that URL is?
Wingspanlegacy.com.
Perfect. Fabulous. Great talking with you. Love your experience. I love how you get to travel the world and meet all these different cultures and all these different industries. It's probably breathtaking, challenging, and exciting.
It's very similar all over the world. A lot of families have a lot of the same issues, and it can be lonely. And so an advisor like yourself, like Wingspan, can help not just, be your friend and have a cup of coffee or beer with you, but to really think through how to do this in a way that's thoughtful, caring, respectful, and responsible.
Maryann, you're always welcome to come back. Thanks for being on the show. Folks, if you got some value from this, please share this with others. Give us a good rating on your podcast listening application of choice, and stay tuned for future episodes of the Disruptive Successor Show.
This podcast is sponsored by myself, Jonathan Goldhill, and my company, the Goldhill Group, where we provide coaching for growing companies. I'm Jonathan Goldhill, and my purpose is simple: to guide entrepreneurial leaders in family businesses towards more freedom and fulfillment. I want entrepreneurs to get clarity around the changes that will make them and their businesses more successful so they can experience the same freedom I've enjoyed in my life. Our proven practices challenge business owners to think differently about their business and how they're running it, and quite literally become game changers in our clients' companies. Learn more at thegoldhillgroup.com website, where you can schedule your free strategy session. Thank you for joining us on the Disruptive Successor podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, review, and share with a friend who would benefit from the message. If you're interested in picking up a copy of my book, Disruptive Successor, go to disruptivesuccessor.com.